The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Perhaps in the current climate, I shouldn't admit this, but this week's guest, Marshall Poe, has lived in the USSR and Russia. His academic specialty was Russian history. He later spent a decade teaching at Harvard before leaving academia to take a position at the Atlantic Monthly. Since then, he founded the New Books Network, or podcasts, and he is the author of the book How to Read a History Book, which came out last month from Zero. It's Wednesday night, February 21st, 2018, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. Before we cut to the interview, I want to take a moment to thank David D.D. and a YouTuber named Subconscious Qualms, as well as some people at the Chomsky Reddit group, for arguing with me after I posted the last Zero Books video about Noam Chomsky and Slavoj Žižek. I especially want to thank the guys at Reddit because they pointed out that while I'd interpreted Chomsky's ontological position as being neo-Kantian, the truth was that in the past, Chomsky had claimed to be a neutral monist. Looking into it a bit, I found out that neutral monism would make Chomsky, at least in some ways, more aligned with Spinoza than with Kant. However, given Chomsky's emphasis on understanding the innate structures of cognition, and specifically language, I would dare to say that his metaphysics are probably not quite aligned with Spinoza either. The truth is, I haven't quite backed off from my original estimation of the consequences of Chomsky's position, but I do realize that the question of his metaphysics is more interesting than I originally realized. It seems to me that Chomsky's position is difficult as any continental philosophers, and I do have to admit that nobody has quite been able to explain it to me in any way I can fully understand.
Well, what you're referring to is what's called theory. And the reason when I said I'm not interested in theory, what I meant is I'm not interested in posturing, using fancy terms like polysyllables and pretending to have theory when you have no theory whatsoever.
I think attempting to understand just what Chomsky's position is and how it is different from, for instance, Foucault's or Deleuze's or even Zizek's is a worthwhile endeavor. If you're looking for a good book to read on the topics I recently covered on Zero Books' YouTube channel, the topics of ontology and objectivity, you might check out Frank Smecker's Night of the World. Also, you might subscribe to the Zero Books YouTube channel to see how my engagement with Chomsky develops and to see how the videos improve. I've been talking to an animation studio in London called Pixel 8 on getting a cut rate deal on their services, and I'm able to get that help because of patrons like Dylan H., Jack H., Muke, Patrick K., Sahir P., and 190 others. If you'd like to help Zero Books expand its digital content production, or if you just want to hear the second half of this week's podcast with Marshall Poe, you should become a Patreon subscriber to the Inside Zero Books podcast. When we reach 400 patrons, we'll be hiring another helping hand to improve our podcasts. The music you're listening to right now is Adios Nonino by Astra Piazzolla. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Marshall Poe and I discuss how to read a history book. Marshall Poe is an American historian, writer, editor, and founder of the New Books Network, an online collection of podcast interviews with a wide range of nonfiction authors. He is also the author of the book How to Read a History Book, which came out this month from Zero Books. Marshall Poe, welcome to the Zero Books podcast.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Doug.
Well, I'm glad to have you on, and I'm glad to have you on because you are a podcaster and an innovator in podcasting. You started the New Books Network, which I listen to regularly, and I come to rely on as I try to send authors your way every once in a while.
Yep.
So tell me, how did you start the New Books Network? When did it start, and what was the idea behind it?
Well, that's actually quite a long story. I won't tell you the whole story because it's pretty boring, actually. So I'd started my career as an academic, and I was a Russian historian, and I wrote books that I thought were pretty interesting, but nobody read them. And one of the things you learn as an academic is that you write these books, and they kind of go off into the ether. And I always tell an anecdote about how after I wrote my first monograph, I asked my mom if she read it, and she said she did, but then I quizzed her, Doug. It was very disappointing, very disappointing.
Oh, your own mother.
Yeah, my own mother. And, she's quite a literate person. She was a high school teacher. So anyway, I did that for about 15 years. And then by a series of very strange connections, I was offered a job at the Atlantic Monthly magazine. It's now called the Atlantic Magazine. And I jumped ship from academia. And I went there because I thought to myself, being kind of an egomaniac, that I could reach a larger audience and I could help kind of translate highbrow ideas in such a way that lots of people would imbibe them in some way or absorb them. And so I worked at the Atlantic Monthly for about 5 years. And it was really while I was there that I had kind of the fundamental insight that led to the New Books Network. And that was that if you want people to listen, and you might be upset about this, Doug, but if you really want people to pay attention to your highbrow ideas, you have to give them to them in a form that they will like. And the form they like is either watching or listening. Because, we were born with watching and listening organs. We don't have a reading organ. Reading is hard, takes a long time. So anyway, I thought to myself, well, yeah, we have to actually get – another thing I had noticed, I should say just by the way, is that when you actually get academics talking about their work, they become really interesting. It's like a magical transformation. If you read their books, well, not so much. And besides, the books are expensive. You probably don't know about them. Some of them aren't very well written, although they're written better than people say. But once you get an academic talking about what they're doing, then it becomes pretty interesting. And I knew this from way back because actually that was true of me. My books were sort of boring, but if you asked me to talk about them, you could actually pay attention to that. So I left the Atlantic Monthly and went back to academia. And at that time, I was writing about the history of communications, of all things. I kind of left Russian history. And I decided to run an experiment. The experiment was that I would conduct one interview a week with a historian who had written a new book, because I'm a historian. And I learned about how to do podcasts. It wasn't terribly difficult. This was about 10 years ago. And I just wanted to see if anyone would listen. And it turned out they did. That's the short story.
Well,
and
that's great. Yeah, I mean, that's what I was looking for, not the all the ins and outs, because I know the ins and outs can be rather dull, especially then I learned how to use an RSS feed.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about that. But basically what happened was I shoved these things on the web, and everybody said to me, yeah, well, they're too long. They're an hour. I said, well, we'll just find out. Let's run the experiment. And it turns out they're not too long. And in fact, we published an interview the other day. It was 2.5 hours long.
Wow.
Listen, I don't know. I can't figure it out.
Well,
but anyway, they did.
One of the most popular podcasts out there is with a guy named Joe Rogan.
Oh, yeah, sure. I know who he is.
Yeah, and he does interviews that last sometimes up to 3 hours.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. Well, we haven't done one that long yet, but we probably will. Because we produce so many. I mean, we produce 100 a month.
I want to just briefly touch down on this Atlantic gig that you had. I'm a short story writer and a novelist, as well as being a publisher of critical theory books. And the Atlantic, of course, is well known to me because for many generations it's been, along with the New Yorker, the place to be published if you're a short story writer. I mean, it'll make your career. Landing a regular gig at the Atlantic seems to me like at that point you can, bless your stars or something that you've?
No, it doesn't really work like that. No, I wouldn't say it really worked like that. And I'll be very honest with you about how I got the job. I was teaching at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. I decided to jump ship from academia. And I used to tell my students at Harvard two things. I said, you got to do two things in my class. One, you have to learn all the material. And the second thing you have to do is remember me when my resume crosses your desk.
Right.
And that worked.
Well, there you go.
Actually worked because somebody I had taught was working at the Atlantic Monthly. And so but I have to say, I was 40 and the people I worked with were 23.
Right.
I had a cubicle. I was as low on the totem pole as you can get there. And, I made coffee, I think, but I wanted to have this switch. I wanted to do something a little bit different. I had spent 15 or 20 years in Russian history and academia, and that was fine. But I kind of felt at that point in my career that I knew everything about Russian history that I wanted to know. So I was ready for something else.
Right. Yeah. Well, teaching at Harvard, you'd already reached pinnacle in the academic or intellectual culture.
Well, I don't know about pinnacles, but it was an interesting place to teach, and I was glad for my experience there. It's fun. Yeah, it's a university, and they're pretty generic universities. I've taught a lot of them. Let me tell you what.
Yeah. Well, as a science fiction writer, who there's an aura around the Atlantic and the New Yorker, so it's a place that genre writers will never reach. And so I just had to bring that up. But I want to talk to you about your book. Which is How to Read a History Book. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, very readable. It doesn't read like an academic tome or, a book published to be distributed in academic libraries. But for me, the difference between the thing that's significant about history is that it's the era in which we can look back on and know that human beings were trying to work out what their existence was about, and communities and societies, and make meaning in the world. And prehistory is all the time that there were just animals running around, just doing what came instinctually. That's wrong, because modern man has been around for 200,000 years, and history only covers 6,000 of those years. But I still think of prehistory and history cleaving along those lines. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Am I getting this wrong? How should I think about a term or these terms, prehistory and history?
Yeah, Doug, you're not going to like this. Yes, you are getting it wrong.
Oh, it's fun to think about what they might
It is, isn't it? It really is.
Oh, what is this?
Well, that is a large carnivorous dinosaur called Allosaurus. And Allosaurus was a meat eater. Probably a very active animal. He would grasp the animals that he was eating with the heavy jaws and teeth, and probably he used his rather small arms for holding on to the prey as he was eating them.
The arms and the fingers.
Yes, those are the fingers there with the large claws on the tips.
Were you interested in dinosaurs when you were a little girl?
Yes, I certainly was. I was interested not only in dinosaurs, but also in other kinds of animals that were extinct. I think it's so interesting to try and find out how animals got the way they are. And, of course, you find out how they got the way they are by studying how these animals lived. That's what makes them very interesting.
Make up their history.
Yes. That's right. Make up their it certainly is prehistory.
Thanks for helping us with our history, Dr. Dawson.
You're welcome. I'm glad you were able to come.
I'm certainly glad myself. See you soon.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Well, if you go to graduate school in history, one of the things they're going to tell you is that prehistory, you might call it prehistory, I don't know if you want to call it that, is the era before written documents. Everything before that's for archaeologists, and the stuff before that is for evolutionary anthropologists, if you're talking about humans. That's kind of the way it breaks. That distinction is even breaking down a little bit further, because we can actually look in people's genes and we can see a lot about what they were doing or even pre-literate, we might say, that is pre-writing times, that is before roughly 6,000 years ago. So, all of that is very interesting. But the sense in what I try to say in the book is that actually history is much younger than even that. So prehistory is really everything before about 1850, because that's really when modern history as a discipline was born. It did not exist before then. And when people wrote stories about the past, they did not write them in the same way that we write them today. The history book that was written by someone like Gibbon, or, I don't know if you take the Old Testament or even the New Testament, because it's kind of a story, these did not have the same function, nor were they written with the same goals or values in mind than the histories that we write today. They're just very different artifacts, kind of from an anthropological, you might even say historical perspective. They're, the modern positivist empiricist history book, that's the kind I'm talking about, the kind that comes out of basically the pen or the word processor of someone who was trained in a graduate program at an American university and then is published by a university press, is a very new thing, like a super new thing.
Right. Okay. So the history as I know it it looks back on 6,000 years, but it doesn't have a 6,000 year history itself.
No, it doesn't. No, absolutely not. If you look at a history book, if you just pick up a history book, one that comes out of a university press or even a popular history book, that is a new kind of thing. That kind of thing, as a genre, you might say, or it's just as a cultural artifact embedded into our culture, is a new thing. It's your great grandfather would not have ever seen such a thing because they really were brand new, and we know where they were invented. It's a little bit like rockets, right? Why is the word for rocket the same in every language? Well, basically because the rocket was invented at a particular time and place, and we knew who did it. The history book was invented at a particular time and place. It was fundamentally written by, it was invented by Germans in the mid to late 19th century. At German universities that were state-funded and founded as research entities and sort of ancillary devices for the German state, or the Prussian state in this case. That's where they were born. And then it was from there that they were disseminated to various places. The same is true of lots of literary genres. If you take, for example, my, forebear, Edgar Allan Poe, it's arguably the case that he invented detective fiction. He just invented it, right? Period. Horror fiction, he invented it. And, you can find predecessors, but, they're pretty far to seek. But in terms of popularizing that genre or codifying it in some way, it's Edgar Allan Poe. He did it. And similarly, we can name who basically created the modern history book. It was a guy named Ranke. And, it was in his seminar that the idea, I'm simplifying here, of the modern positivist empiricist history book really was born. The kind that we read today, the kind that backs up every university history course, and the kind that every academic writes.
Just to go back to my kind of erroneous thinking for a second, the split between prehistory and history that I'm thinking about also seems to be a split between the sciences and the humanities.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that's, yeah. The thing about it is history, you can get really tied up in knots about this sort of terminology, but history is a science. It doesn't belong in the humanities. It belongs in the social sciences. And, that's the way the Germans talk about it. It's Wissenschaft. It's not anything else. And the way that historians are trained, they're trained to tell a true – they're supposed to write a true story about the past with true understricken and in all caps. It's got to be true. And that's the correspondence theory of truth. And the thing it has to correspond to is what we find in artifacts that come to us from this place we can't go called the past. They come to us, and we find them in the present, and what we do is we look at them, and we put them in chronological order, we derive information from them, and essentially what we do is we write a story, and it's a true story because it corresponds with those documents, and it can only be true insofar as those documents have information. That isn't the way the humanities treat stories at all.
Right.
Thank God.
Right.
Because, you could make up all kinds of really interesting stories that are true in some other sense, that they are connected to, archetypes of some sort. How many times has the, Joseph Campbell-esque heroic journey been written? It's basically behind almost everything. And that's great because there's something true about that. Humans are sort of built to overcome things, and there's, comedy where bad shit happens and then it comes out okay. And there's tragedy where bad shit happens and everything doesn't come out okay. And these are really valuable, interesting stories. They're not true.
Well, when I look back on my time at the university in the 90s, and I just got a bachelor's degree, I don't remember the historians and the physicists hanging out together, or even the historians and the biologists hanging out together, or even the social sciences and the historians, maybe they hung out together more than I knew. I was over in the philosophy department. I was, as a philosopher, not able to hang out with anyone. But how close, as in departments today, is history to the actual sciences? Or
I don't think they're as close as they should be, to be quite honest with you. Because if you look at it carefully, you mentioned physicists. Well, what exactly is I'm looking for a word here. What is the study of stars called? Please.
Astronomy.
Astronomy. What is astronomy but a historical discipline? I mean, you look out into the universe and you see the past. In fact, you see the past a really long time ago, like billions of years ago. You look out there. These people are studying information from a place called the past, which has come to them in the present, and it keeps coming. But that's the past they're looking at. There's no question about it. So astronomy and history, essentially, empirically, sort of philosophically, structurally, are the same thing. That's what we do as historians. We go, we have these artifacts that come to us from the past, and we try to reconstruct what happened. That's what astronomers do. I mean, they do a lot of other things as well, because they have to do them in order to kind of get the story straight. But they get the story straight by essentially receiving information from the past. Now, their information is borne by photons, but our information is borne by documents and artifacts and things like this. But that's another good example is if you look at evolutionary biology. What is that but a historical discipline? That's all it is. You essentially look through the historical record to try to figure out what happened. That's information. It's not information. It's artifacts that come from this place called the past where we can't go except in science fiction. And it comes to us in the present. And then we say, well, okay, on the basis of this information that we have received from this place called the past, what can we say about that place? I mean, they're the same thing. I mean, they're absolutely the same thing. Now, the tricky thing is that you're talking about people with history, and that makes it political. I mean, we usually don't talk about it this way, but it's just automatically political. I mean, period, end of story. You're talking about other people. And as everybody knows, when you start talking about other people, they're going to start paying attention to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right? So in that way, yeah, they're different. Yeah, I mean, they're different. But, you can think about this kind of – they're really quite similar to these. Astronomy is one. Evolutionary biology is another. I mean, these are just – they're the historical disciplines. And history is one of them.
In your book, you wrote that the history of the history book is connected to the history of industry and technology, and that the university changed probably before the history book was invented, that it stopped.
Yeah, it did.
Go ahead.
It did because, universities used to be, and I'm not an expert on this, but universities were essentially clerical institutions that were run by churches. I mean, and they trained priests. I mean, if you look at Harvard College, for example, that's what it did. It trained clerics. It was so casual about actually what other people did that they would sell you an MA for a certain amount of money. They didn't really care. They were interested in producing. They really would. I'm not kidding. They would sell you an MA. And so they produced clerics. Now, of course, they produced a whole bunch of other people as well. And they trained gentlemen, and, they were finishing schools and places to become, basically gain status. But it really wasn't until Germany in the 19th century, when the German state, or the Prussian state in this case, really got interested in essentially funding scientific research. And where were they going to do it? Well, Germany has actually a lot of institutes that aren't in universities. We don't have that tradition in the United States. But they also funded universities. And universities essentially became the handmaidens, so to say. I don't mean to be gendered about it. They became the helpers of the state. And the state began to fund university professors. And what the state was interested in was what the university professors were into, because the state was funded, basically footing the bill. And so similarly with history, this is what happens. This is when you see the first really history faculties that weren't almost entirely devoted to the study of the classics. I mean, that's what history used to mean. If you go back into the 17th century, history meant the study of the classics. And so you read Herodotus or something, or Thucydides. That's what it meant. Nobody thought about studying, some people did, but they were really weird, like Gibbon. But there weren't any history professors. I mean, not in the modern sense. They weren't writing monographs. They weren't funded by the state. They were people of means. There were exceptions to all these things. But nonetheless, this was the brunt of the thing. The modern history department, funded by the state or funded by tuition, where they practice what is essentially science, and they try to reconstruct the past and produce true stories about the past, I mean true with a capital T stories, according to correspondence theory, that is a 19th century phenomenon. And it started in Germany, and it was brought to the United States. We even know who brought it. It was this guy Adams, because he'd studied in Germany. He brought it over here, and they sort of instituted it in the United States, and then it kind of spread.
So what was happening in Germany, and what year was this that the history book was invented?
I don't think you can pin it down to a year. It was a long, in the long 19th century. It was sometime in there that it kind of became, people talk about it as if it's Ranke's seminar in which they did this, where they actually looked at documents, and they're very interested in documents. So they go look in archives. And these kind of things are archetypes for historians. You go to an archive and you look at documents, and the archive has to be ordered, and you put the documents in chronological order. And this is the kind of thing they did in Ranke's seminar. And so he was writing modern history. What they meant by modern then, essentially what modern meant was now. Contemporary history of now. And all of the kind of history was basically what the Greeks and the Romans did. That's what most people cared about. But these people writing about essentially some people who are still alive or had been alive 100 years previous, who were also Germans of some sort, or they were, Europeans of some sort usually. So you can't exactly date it in that way, but the invention of the modern university press would be a pretty good way to date it. And modern university presses, that means not Oxford, not Cambridge, and probably a few others. I'm sorry I don't mention them, but modern university presses in the United States are a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon. I think they're early 20th century. I'm sorry, I can't be specific about the dates, because those institutions published the history book.
Okay, and this was a product of the state.
In Europe, it was. Yeah, in Europe, it was. Yes.
When you are an engineer and you're developing a technology and you're doing research in order to develop a technology, you have an aim. You want to do something with what you develop. Mm-hmm. When you're a physicist, or an astronomer, there's a question that you're trying to answer. Like when was this star born, or what is the nature of a star, or how does gravity work? Those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. What kinds of questions were those inventors of the history book trying to answer, or what were they trying to do when they set out to scientifically study the recent and distant past?
Well, I mean, I think I'm exaggerating a little bit here for effect, because there were people that wrote things that look a little bit like modern history books, given as a classic example before the 19th century. But the whole apparatus that we have, that is with bibliography and the footnotes and the archival references and all that other stuff that you find in every history book now, that is a late 19th century German phenomenon. And what they were trying to do was write true stories about the past. And the question that you're asking now kind of involves values and not facts. And so they were interested in the things they were interested in. And the things that 19th century Germans were interested in were earlier parts of German history, essentially. And so Ranke was a diplomatic historian. And it was all basically studies of what we would call either high culture or high politics. They were interested in kings and princes and presidents and parliaments and these sorts of things, affairs of state, because these were the kinds of people that might conceivably read these books. And they were the audience for. There's no notion that everyone would ever read these books. They were basically for elites, and the serious things in life that men did, and they were all men at this time. They were involved in wars and politics and this kind of stuff. Important things that kind of had transformative effects on the lives of these people. Not everybody, just these people. It was only later that history departments became very balkanized into many, many, many different segments, both spatial and temporal. That is to say, there were ancient historians and modern historians. There were just historians. And a German historian studied German history, and that was pretty much that. And they might study Italian history, but it was only Italian history insofar as it bore on the Roman Empire or something. So, I should also say that American history departments are very peculiar in this way, even early on, because we studied everything, not just America, right? We really studied everything.
But the aim was maybe to understand what the true story of the past was when it came to statecraft.
Well, it could be, statecraft would be a nice way to put it. Yeah, that's basically what you find, is most of the histories are what we might call diplomatic histories, or they're what we would call political history today. Some of them are biographies of very important people, Bismarck and such. But they, you don't see the, vast array of different sort of topics that you see in modern history. That came a little bit later. Go ahead.
You could justify the funding from the state by saying, look, by understanding the past, you're going to have a better grasp on the present, and you will have a better mastery of statecraft today.
Yeah, you might say that. It could have that positivistic sort of gloss. I don't think it did very much. I don't think people thought about it. No, I mean, but, one connection is also it's both social and institutional, and that is to get into these state archives, you kind of had to be one of those people. They're not just going to let anybody in there. And if you're going to go in there, they want to know what you're doing. And they're also, because this is an era of censorship, they're also going to want to know what you're going to write. I mean, there was no freedom of access to these states' archives or anything like that. You could just wander in there and look around. So, yeah, the state funded research into itself. I mean, that's one way to look at it. In that way, it's a little bit like the Pentagon Papers. It's, Robert McNamara says, this isn't going right. We need to get some historians to try to figure out what happened. And, similarly, the state was funding a kind of endeavor that involved really tracking, what had happened, what things of significance that had happened. Now, I should also say that a lot of it was very heavily politicized, and some of it was just designed to apologize in the older sense of apologize, that is to sort of excuse or to glorify what somebody had done. It wasn't neutral in any way, and it wasn't critical. This came later when history departments kind of gained a little bit of independence from this political elite.
Well, but how does the aim of telling a true story allow you to not be critical? I mean,
it's really easy. It's really easy. I mean, because, for any given set of facts, there's sort of an infinite number of interpretations, and interpretation always bleeds into these things because the facts themselves are incomplete. And besides, you're writing a narrative. You're not basically trying to reduce information to a system of equations. If you were doing that, then you actually don't need that much information, because once you have your third or fourth or fifth trial, it all matches and it's good. But this isn't the way history works, because there's a lot of detail. I mean, more than we could ever imagine, especially once you get into modern times. And so the number of histories that could be written is really very broad. And in fact, you can see it in the historiographical record itself. I mean, we can see people who were heroes in the 19th century are now villains, and vice versa. So, it kind of depends on your gloss of the thing. And it's the same events we're talking about. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened, right? A, B, C, and D. But your gloss on it, or kind of moral that you want to hide in it, and we're really not supposed to do that, historians, but we do it, is going to change very much depending on, the zeitgeist or the times involved.
As your body grows bigger,
your mind must flower.
It's great to learn,
'cause knowledge is power. It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the chip off the block of your favorite Schoolhouse Rock.
One thing that would differentiate the project of history from, say, biology or physics or some of the other sciences, or even psychology or social science, is that it'd be very hard to test a hypothesis in history.
Yeah, well, the only way you can test it is basically to go back and look at the documents. And this is exactly what historians do all the time. This is the standard element of historical criticism. So there was this thing that happened with a historian from Duke named Nancy McLean. I don't know if you heard about it. She wrote a book about the rise of, what she claimed to be the rise of, I don't know what you want to call it, but a sort of a right-wing agenda in the United States. Mm-hmm. And she published this book to great acclaim. And a lot of people who weren't historians reviewed it. And they said it was the greatest book of all time. Well, that's essentially because it said what they wanted to hear.
Right.
Okay, so that's fine. But then actual historians went and looked at it, and they said, well, you know what? This doesn't correspond very well to what we see in the record. And that's just basically what they did is they tested what she said against the record that they knew. And this is what we do all the time. You go back to the sources, you look at her words, you look at, or any historian's words, and you look at the record and you say, well, this doesn't correspond very well.
Now,
so
what is this record? I mean, what counts enough to be part of the record that you're...
Yeah, we just call these primary sources. And primary sources are sources which are extraordinarily close to the events themselves. They're either written by people who experienced them, who saw the activity involved, who were party to the activity involved, people who were there at the time. In other words, not people writing about people who saw the events of the time, but the people who were there themselves. They're very close to the event.
So the New York Times is a paper of record, but they're often writing about events that they're not actually part of.
Well, that's right. And, this is a tricky kind of in-between category newspapers because, the journalists might have been there and might have seen something and might have talked to people. So that could, in a way, be called a primary source. But from another point of view, it's also a distillation of a lot of sources. But the closer you can get to actual eyewitness or someone who's had agency in the situation, somebody who acted in the situation, that's close to a primary source, right? So, for some purposes, it's kind of fascinating to think about. I teach about this at the university sometimes. If you take, I'm trying to think of a really good example. So I teach in this Great Books program, and we teach Plato. And one of the things I explain to people is that, the oldest manuscript of Plato that we have, I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth, but, it's like 15th century. Plato's supposed to live 2,000 years ago. So what about the 1,500 or 2,000 years in which we don't have any manuscripts of Plato? What are you going to do with that? I mean, that's tough. We don't have any primary accounts of Plato. We know nothing about Plato. We don't even know if there was a Plato. 2,000 years is a long time. And there are no manuscripts, no nothing. I mean, there are mentions of Plato by other writers, but then if you look at those documents, they're not old either. They're copies of copies of copies of copies. Again, I'm exaggerating for effect, but it's a well-known problem in terms of what we might call Christian history, because documents about Christ are pretty far to seek, and none of them are contemporary with Christ. And, in a case like Buddhism, it's even worse. You have thousands of years where nothing was written down. And so no primary sources, essentially. So what do you say? Well, you work with what you have. That's what you do. And, you work with what you have. And that's what we have.
Well, I want to throw another problem into the mix, which is just the difficulties you might have in the present in determining the true story of an event based on witness testimony. In trials, they found that eyewitness testimony is essential, but it's also often entirely distorted.
Sure, yeah, and one of the things that the character in the book, Liz Runke, learns in graduate school is that, every document comes from a context. It's all, it reminds me a little bit of phenomenology. Phenomenologists, they like to say, when you see a car, you don't just see the car. You see lots of associations that you see your memory of a car, there's lots attached to just carness. It's not just the car you see, and it dredges up lots of things. Well, it's similar with these artifacts. They were produced in a context where people were producing them. They meant lots of things, which are totally lost to us. Completely 100% lost. And we look at the document, and I'll give you an example. So I studied 16th, 17th century Russia for a very long time, and we look at a written document, and we think to themselves, oh, well, who can write? Well, we know a little bit about our American history or sort of recent history in general, and like people who were of means and who were educated can write. They're the first people to become literate. But actually in 16th and 17th century, we bring that to the document. We say, oh, here's a 16th century document. It must have been written by somebody who was very well educated and somebody who was of means and probably a noble. And, because those are the kinds of people who learn to write. Well, it's just the opposite in Russia. Writing was a servile enterprise. No person of their salt would think about writing anything down. It was just not something that was done for these people. Only people who wrote were the next thing to slaves.
Wow.
So yeah, they were servers. They were servants of people. They didn't assert. It was a servile enterprise, and that's what people did it for money. It was not, it was not a sign of education or literacy or status or anything like that. Quite the opposite. If you were writing stuff down, it meant that, it was a good thing to be able to do. You could earn a living with it, but it was not, it's like being a car mechanic today. Car mechanic gets a good living, but, the Nobel Prize Committee is probably not going to call you.
Right. Well, but that would mean that the things that they wrote down weren't generally their own thoughts?
Oh, no, they weren't. Yeah, of course not. No, they never wrote their own thoughts down. They wrote down legal documents and things like this, sort of boilerplate stuff that people needed in order to get things done. It was also completely, it was just for utility. It wasn't, people weren't writing their thoughts down or anything like that. No, but, to your more general point, that all of these artifacts and the writing or not writing that they have in them, that includes pictures and all manner of visual stuff, they all come freighted with a whole bunch of associations, which are pretty much lost to us. And we kind of have to reconstruct them in some way.
Yeah. And you have the same problem in literary departments and how to interpret.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. Yeah. Right. That's exactly the same thing. Because you're going to bring your eyes to whatever it is you're looking at, just like, if you look at an artifact with American eyes, you see one thing, but if you're, I don't know, from Nepal and you look at the same thing, you're going to see something different. It's the same thing, but you're going to bring different associations to it. You have no choice about that, right? There's no choice.
So one of the things you're doing in your book, and I mean, maybe the primary thing you're doing in your book, is you're contextualizing the history book.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what I wanted to do. I mean, I wrote the book essentially because I had undergraduates who I would say, well, this is sort of what this thing is, and this is how they didn't know I had a PhD. I mean, these were not kids. I was teaching at the University of Iowa at a time, and it's that, they're middle-class kids from Des Moines, and so they're very smart. But, they just didn't know a lot about academia, and they didn't know where all this stuff came from, and they didn't know anything about how I was trained. They didn't know much about graduate school. They didn't know what we went through and what we were taught. They didn't know that this artifact that I was using to teach them was a new tool. And I just thought to myself, if you're going to understand what I'm telling you, you kind of have to understand a little bit about the way I was trained and people like me were trained, what kind of habits we have, what kind of instructions we're given, what kind of ways in which we transmit the knowledge we have from one generation to another. And this is, in the device that I used for that was the history book. This kind of, I looked at it like an anthropologist. Like, okay, if you just saw this thing, what the hell is it? Actually, it's funny because in my graduate seminars, I happen to own a 16th century book. And it is the letters of the church fathers, and they are in Greek. And then the Greek is translated into Latin, so people could read it. Think about that for a second. So people could read it, right? It's a 16th century book. It was produced during the Counter-Reformation. And I used to give it to my graduate students to just say, tell me about this. What the hell is this? Well, it's kind of weird. It's a weird artifact. It really is. If you look at it, it's really strange. It's in board. It's basically bound in boards, and it's leather covered, and it has all this. It has different book plates in it, and then it has Greek in it. And what's that? I mean, Greek script and Greek language, and then it's in Latin, and it's a weird thing. And they don't know what it is. They really don't. They have no idea what it is. They can't associate it with the Counter-Reformation. They can't read Greek. They can't read Latin. They don't know. They just don't know. It's like a mystery. Well, that's kind of the way I felt that my undergraduates were looking at these monographs, these books. They were from Mars to them, and they couldn't really understand what they were. So I said, well, I'm going to write a story about somebody like me and what I did to write one of these books, and then what the parts of the book mean. Because the different parts of the books mean different things.
I feel like I am that undergraduate who has to, I thought I knew what a history book was before, but now I'm not so sure. And so are there different schools of thought? There must be, of how to interpret that record and what the methodologies would be, to accurately interpret that record. I mean, it seems like you'd have to be a historian, you'd have to know several ancient languages.
Well, no, I mean, I see what you're driving at there. At least I think I do. And the fact of the matter is you can probably go and you can read thousands and thousands of pages that differentiate these different sorts of. But the answer is no. It's one technique. You go and you look at the artifacts that are from this place called the past. You put everything in chronological order. You interpret the information in such a way that you can tell a story that's plausible given the parameters of human activity and also the context of the time, that is the culture of the time. That's it. That's what we all do. I mean, historians will, academics love to differentiate themselves from some other people. So they're always taking turns. I don't know if you've ever heard of this stuff. Like when I was in graduate school, it's like the linguistic turn. I don't know what that means. Right. And now there's some other turn. And these turns are always happening. But the fact of the matter is that the basic technique that's involved is the exact same one that astronomers use and evolutionary biologists use. And basically you just look at the evidence that's from this place called the past, this kind of fictional place we don't know anything about. And we try to verify the provenance of the documents to make sure they're genuine. And then once we've done that, then we apply sort of standard analytic tools, reason and experience and knowledge. And we try to figure out essentially what the most plausible interpretation of the information in these facts is. That's it. That's the historical technique. It isn't anything else. So that's it.
So, okay. So like in the literature departments, you'll have all sorts of interpretive models that get generated. Like, okay, I'm going to do a Freudian interpretation of this text. I'm going to do a Marxist interpretation of this text. I'm going to do, postmodern interpretation of this text. None of that happens in the history departments.
Oh, all of that happens in the history department. I don't think that those are kind of overlays, I would say, interpretive overlays of various kinds that tend to be a little bit axe grindy. But the basic positivist technique is to find out what happened, and you do that just the way they do it in a court of law. You go and you conduct an investigation, and you have investigators, and what do they look at? Well, they look at the past, right? They do it by interrogating people. If they got really cold case, they can't do that, so they got to look at documents, and essentially that's what they do. I mean, kind of a famous example that was given a long time ago by a famous American historian. He said people don't even do this anymore, but it's like balancing your checkbook once a month. That's what it is. You're looking at this historical data about what you did, and you try to figure out what it meant. Like, where did I spend my money? Well, here's what happened, and it really is like that. You know, the Marxist interpretation and the Freudian interpretation, and Foucault and the postmodernists and all the other stuff, and metahistory and hyperhistory and microhistory, and it's all pretty much the same thing when it comes down to method. The method is exactly the same, although historians, I think they have a little bit of physics envy or something about this. It's been called physics envy, that they want to make it seem more complicated than it is, but it's actually not very complicated at all.
There's something called the principle of charity when you're reading, right? Where you're supposed to try to read a sentence or a paragraph or a book and try to come up with the most rational explanation you can as to what the meanings of the words are. And that, like, you assume that the author isn't attempting to be absurd if you can, or say things that are self-contradictory. And if there's an interpretation that allows you to assume the author isn't being absurd or self-contradictory, for instance, you go with that interpretation. But then, there are other approaches to reading where you'd say, yeah, actually, though, because of the way the human subject operates, you really should be looking for those contradictions and connotations, because the unconscious is always trying to peek through. So it's always in the moments where there could be a contradiction or something absurd that you're going to find something that's really revelatory about what the person, maybe against his own inclinations or conscious wishes, was expressing. So, would you say the historians, in order to get that primary true story, have to lean towards the principle of charity in their reading of the record?
Well, I would just say that we try to find the most plausible interpretation of what we find in the past so that we can conduct a story that we can basically convey to the present, or plausibility, a lot of weight on that word, obviously. But, this might involve some of the kind of things that you're talking about. But generally speaking, again, I think the best history is a kind of just stick to the facts kind, and it presents the facts. I mean, certainly you have to contextualize all the documents that you find. So I wrote a book once about people that traveled to Russia a really long time ago. I had to understand the genre that they were writing in. It was a rather peculiar genre. It was pretty new. There were travel accounts. Travel accounts were new at the time. The printing press was new. So I had to contextualize all that because there were things they said and things they didn't say because of the rules of the genre. And, for all I know, some of the people that wrote them were nuts and were just liars. And I looked for, and they were, and I looked for the signs of those things, in the documents themselves. And I did standard literary criticism, or just, I got called logical criticism. I look for contradictions. That would be a key. That when somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, they contradict themselves. So I look for that, and I look for obvious biases. The person, if they'd been screwed by the Russians and they went and wrote a really negative account of the Russians, well, you got to kind of wonder about that. And so I think those standard interpretive techniques, yeah, we use them just like anybody else would use them. And we're trained to use them, yeah.
Coming out of the, doing critical theory and coming out of the philosophical part of the university, to the extent I come out of the university at all, I'm always trying to poke holes in anybody who says, yeah, no, I just got this sort of common sense, rational approach to interpreting the world or interpreting historical record, and it's not complicated. And and anyone who's trained and a certain level of intelligence, say, can do it. And this is what it's aiming at, is to try to tell the true story of the past. It's like, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it seems naive in a way. I mean, I absolutely understand that. But, we should look at the way that we actually operate in the world. And this is the way we run our lives. And we run our lives as if we can tell stories about the past that are true. Our entire judicial system is built on it. Our banking system is built on this. We think that we can construct at least we can say it is very useful to construct a verisimilar picture of the past, one that, passes the basic scientific criterion of what I used to call it intersubjective verifiability. People don't like verifiability anymore, but the fact of the matter is this is the way we live our lives. And humans just do this kind of thing. We report information to one another. There's a whole theory about this is why speech evolved. It's called relevance theory. And so we bring relevant information to other people. And the most relevant information, I don't know if it's the most, but a good portion of the relevant information, like there's food over there, if it's not true, you're kind of in trouble because you damaged your reputation. And you really want a good reputation so you can reproduce. Other people will not ally with you if you can't. So this is why in the cases where historians have really kind of not done, at least to my mind, really let the public down, it's when they haven't essentially told the truth about the past. And they do it quite a bit. More than I'm often surprised of the reticence of people, historians, to admit they were wrong about something. They write something in a book, people go back and look at the documents, it's wrong, and they won't say, yeah, I screwed up. It's just always surprising to me. I know I screwed up a lot in my own work, but this is a real problem because all that we have, and this is a point I make in the book, as historians, people that want to tell true stories about the past, all that we have really is people's trust. Because you're not going to go look up all those footnotes, right? If you take the case of Nancy McLean again, they sent this book, in this case, they sent this book. It was called, I forget what it was called, Democracy in Flames or something. And they sent this book to be interviewed by somebody at NPR. Definitely, if you're a publicist, you want your books, reviewed on NPR. And so they gave it to a novelist, I'm sure very intelligent person. The novelist said it was the greatest thing ever.
Hey.
No, but the fact of the matter is, the novelist just read something she liked because it basically said there was this right-wing cabal or something like this that somehow had set up the future, which is, again, I'm not an American historian. I don't know. But she cannot be expected to go look up all those footnotes and go to all those archives.
Right.
She just can't. So, but some people did, and they were professional historians, essentially, and economists, and they went and looked them up. And it was not good. What they found was not good.
Right. Well, wait a minute, though. If you send a book on physics or even anthropology to a reviewer, there's a sense that, there used to be anyway, a guy who was assigned to review science books because he had some background in science and could do at least some checking. Is that not the case when it comes to reviewing? It's
definitely the case, except for this kind of book, which is essentially what they call in the press, in the industry, a crossover book. That is a history book, which is essentially a monograph. That is the kind of thing that is usually published by a university press and is really for the consumption of other scholars and maybe their students when they think they can sell this book to a broader group. And that's what happened with this book by Nancy McLean, is that it was published by a big trade press. Trade press had an army of publicists. The army of publicists said, okay, here's a book that says something that a lot of people want to hear. And so we're going to really go to town trying to get a review of it on NPR and in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and every other place, we can possibly get it. And so they sent the army of publicists out, and they did a good job, right? But the people who were reviewing those books even at places like the New York Times, even at places like NPR, even at places like The Atlantic are not area experts. They don't know. And they can't be expected to know, any more than I could give you, for example, some paper in the mathematical discipline of combinatorics and expect you to understand it, or, some theoretical physics paper and understand it. You can't do that. It's not your job, right?
I don't know. I don't know. When did this happen? Because it seems to me like the way I remember the past is that newspapers had guys who had beats, and they were expected to know things.
In this case, I can tell you absolutely, they sent this book called Democracy in Chains to a novelist. Now, I'm sure the novelist was very well intentioned. The novelist clearly liked the book because it corresponded with something that she wanted to hear. Now, she also may have brought her own critical acumen to it, which is terrific. I think that's great. But the way you tell whether a history book is accurate is the same way you tell whether a scientific experiment works. It corresponds with the data or it doesn't. And she can't be expected to know that because gathering that data takes, years and years, and you also have to know all of the context. So in a weird sort of sense, that's why I say what we have is trust. We can only rely on people to trust us. And in these cases where, historians make mistakes, and I'm not saying that MacLean made a mistake. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I'm just saying I saw what happened. There were serious people who said that this book was full of errors. I don't know. But she didn't back off a bit, not even a little bit. She'd made no concessions to them. That really hurts the whole discipline. That's not the way we're trained. We're trained basically to listen to our critics and adjust the narrative accordingly. And that's the way science works, right? You run the experiment doesn't work, you readjust your hypothesis, you run it again.